I'm going to introduce my colleagues in a moment, but maybe just a few brief words from me by way of introduction. I think there's no doubt that the change in the business landscape over the last year has presented unprecedented and significant challenges at all levels, certainly commercial. In some respects, I think trends that were already apparent have been accelerated, but in others, the environment, I think, is completely new territory. And notwithstanding the recent vaccine advances, potentially very uncertain, maybe threatening, and on a forward-looking basis, perhaps lacking any real sense of visibility. We think that the challenges many businesses face, whether they come from within or for that matter externally, are particularly relevant to this forum and to the General Counsel. So why do this session now? To us, there are a few reasons. In the UK, the official statistics suggest that both insolvencies and administration appointments are weak. Year on year to the end of the third quarter, administration appointments, which were rising as we came out of 2019, are down roughly 50%. Financial assistance in the form of job support schemes, around £150 billion of business loans that will need repaying, and various other government-led support initiatives all go towards probably explaining the administration statistics. But I think the inevitability that these measures can in some way only be temporary suggests to us significant problems ahead. Debt levels have been rising fast, and in the listed sector, the second quarter saw very significant levels of secondary market raises from a very diverse range of corporates, as many tried to assess risk, ensure liquidity, bolt down cash flows, and in many cases reset business plans. In addition, I think perhaps not unexpectedly, we already know that our financial investigations practice has been seeing an increasing flow of cases associated in this environment with financial fraud at all levels of the corporate hierarchy, employee wrongdoing, and possibly at a higher pace, non-performing loans, actually, as the stresses of the current situation start to manifest themselves in a variety of different ways. What we also know on this side of the screen, if I may put it like that, is that our restructuring practices and our financial investigations practice have found themselves starting to collaborate more often in this period than perhaps at any stage prior, which in itself, I think, is telling us something. One of the things that we will also talk to you today is our observation and sense that if ever there was a time to revisit the effectiveness of corporate governance and the management of risk, it feels to us like that time is now. So we're hoping this morning that our shared insights into what we both think and what we're experiencing, perhaps in equal measure, will be interesting. Before I go any further, I'd like to just introduce my colleagues who form the panel for today's session in the order in which they'll speak. Firstly, Chris Coley, who's from our restructuring practice. Chris is a very experienced in mid and large scale financial restructuring. He's going to talk about UK government support, corporate response to COVID-19 and the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act 2020. From our financial investigations practice, Zoe Newman and Ben Bora. Zoe heads that practice for us on a global basis, and they're going to talk about the current drivers of financial crime, including overseas operations, false reporting, internal and external threats and the steps that can be taken to mitigate risks in those circumstances, elements of which will involve internal compliance, and we'll talk briefly about the use of corporately held data. And then from the restructuring operation, Rob Armstrong and Eddie Bynes. Rob's going to talk to contentious insolvency and litigation. What are the origins of contentious situations? What are the options, and how best to secure recovery? And Eddie will talk to some key elements of corporate governance and the need in many cases actually for corporate simplification. So I think we really have three objectives, to be honest with you, today. Firstly, as I said, to give you an insight into what we're actually seeing now on a day-to-day basis, what types of situations we're being asked to address, and where are the live trends. Secondly, to give you some sense of how we think we see 2021, where I think collectively we have a real sense that there's a point of inflection coming in terms of activity in 2021. And thirdly, to be honest, if we achieve those first two objectives, then you'll have met, albeit virtually, a small number of our practitioners from both the restructuring practice and the financial investigations practice, who we want you to look at as being there to help you whenever in your roles you may need it. So the structure of the session is that we're going to go through a small deck of slides. I do intend that we make time at the end of the session for a Q&A, so I'd encourage you either to use the button or the chat line for that. And then I'll take those sessions, you know, once we've walked through the deck. And I think I probably don't need to say any more now by way of an introduction. I think I'm going to pass the baton over to Chris. Chris, maybe you can kick us off.
Thank you, Neil. Morning, everyone. By way of introduction, my name is Chris Coley, and I'm a Managing Director in the Global Restructuring Advisory Team at Duff Phelps, based in London. Clearly, it goes without saying that these are unprecedented times of radical uncertainty due to the pandemic, a phrase you may have indeed heard a lot over the past few months. And it's fair to say that our clients are each experiencing their own set of unique challenges as a consequence. Our clients are a mix of corporates, lending institutions, and other stakeholders that right now we are assisting in navigating their way through the pandemic, primarily through liquidity management and restructuring options. With that context, what I wanted to take you through this morning was an overview of where we find ourselves now in terms of government support, where we may expect to see, what we may expect to see when that stimulus falls away, how we're helping many of our clients in respect to their management of and response to the crisis, and provide a brief overview of the restructuring landscape given new measures recently introduced. My overview will be UK focused, however many elements may apply more widely to European and potentially global situations, and where this may be relevant to you as General Counsel may not be your own business, but those closely connected to yours through supply chains or other operational relationships. So what we've seen in the UK is that the government stimulus package is provided in the form of loan schemes and other support, such as the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme and deferral of certain tax liabilities, has assisted many corporates in initially being able to protect their positions. This has also played a part in the lower insolvency statistics that Neil mentioned earlier. In excess of 140 billion of state guaranteed loans has been provided across multiple schemes for companies of a wide range of size in the UK, including the Business Interruption Loan Schemes, Bounce Back Loan Scheme, Corporate Financing Facility and Future Fund. Much of the support provided has assisted in generating necessary liquidity for many corporates, and indeed, along with assessing other sources of liquidity, this was an immediate focus of our assistance at the outbreak of the pandemic, helping corporates understand and, where available, utilise government support, as well as helping to assess strategic options and generally offering assistance to protect value for all stakeholders. Many of these schemes, along with the UK furlough scheme, were extended prior to the UK entering its recent second lockdown and will continue into the new year. Absent containment of the virus, it is uncertain whether support will continue to be extended. However, what is clear is that support cannot go on indefinitely, and many corporates are considering the impact of this and how their business will have to adapt to survive in what will be a continued period of uncertainty as the economy seeks to recover from the pandemic. With this in mind, what we expect to see when support falls away are returning workforces into amended or restructuring business models, supply chain vulnerabilities further compounded by Brexit, potential weakened demand for product or services, leveraged balance sheets, accrued liabilities, and depleted cash balances. All of these will have an impact on many corporates, and financial restructurings may play a significant role in resetting or right-sizing businesses for the future trading environment. As a result, it has never been more important to strategically assess financial positions, target operating models, and governance frameworks. Next page, please. With all this in mind, liquidity will continue to be a critical aspect in ensuring corporates have an ability to weather any continued storm, and indeed pursue any consensual restructuring solutions if required, or even perhaps take advantage of opportunities to restore or maximise positions in a post-pandemic world, for example, industry consolidation. Depending on the time taken to contain the virus, sources of liquidity will continue to be heavily utilised. Indeed, our colleagues at Lucid, an agency trustee service, have seen significant levels of drawdown requests on facilities and requests in respect to amendments and waivers to existing facility agreements, including deferring principal and interest payments, as well as waiving certain covenant positions. Many of the sources available to companies may have been utilised, but for some they may also still exist. These include from the sponsor, management of working capital, suppliers, customers, existing lenders, or even new third parties. All of these have their own implications in terms of potential requirements of the business and balance sheet impact, but whatever the position, a proportionate business plan and robust governance framework will be essential in having the ability to pursue these avenues of financing and demonstrating cash resilience. Next page, please. In addition to liquidity considerations, corporates need to be cognizant that any prolonged reduction activity may result in cost-cutting measures, including redundancies. Conversely, there are certain costs that may be necessary to incur to better protect a company's position. Safety and compliance in accordance with government guidelines has its own cost implications, but is clearly essential in order to be able to continue to operate. The ability to outsource or carry out certain functions remotely may help mitigate certain health and safety requirements, but again have cost implications. With restrictions in travel and movement, operations and supply chains have been impacted, and the likelihood is that many will continue to be weak or have bottlenecks. Compounded by Brexit, companies may have to look to domestic markets ahead of international markets as we recover, which will again potentially impact costs that may not be able to be passed on to the end customer. An effective governance framework will be critical to many companies, not only to demonstrate an ability to navigate the pandemic externally to stakeholders, but also internally to be able to make effective and prompt decisions and to reprioritise strategic objectives as required. The same also applies to reporting and management information, as transparency where possible and regular dialogue should be sought if continued stakeholder support is required financially or in respect to supply chain or other operational issues. Indeed, governance will be a theme touched upon throughout this presentation by my colleagues also. Next page, please. With all these considerations in mind, it is helpful context to understand what restructuring support or tools are available to companies seeking to navigate their way through the pandemic and considering how to adjust themselves to life after. The Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act, which came into effect in June 2020, has introduced several significant changes to UK insolvency legislation. Some of these are temporary measures brought into effect in response to the coronavirus pandemic to mitigate the effects of lockdown. Others, however, are permanent measures that result from a consultation process to amend the Insolvency Act, which began in 2016 and concluded in 2018. Those temporary measures include the suspension of wrongful trading provisions involving personal liability for directors and the suspension of winding up petitions if grounds are related to COVID-19. The wrongful trading provisions are in place to discourage directors from continuing to trade a business when it is insolvent and at the risk of exposing creditors to greater loss. The suspension of these provisions in response to COVID provided directors with some additional comfort in being able to continue to trade during the pandemic. This suspension originally expired at the end of September 2020 without being extended. However, it was recently extended again 2 days ago, which shows how fluid the support is and now remains in place until the end of April next year. A restriction in respect to winding up petitions remains in place until the end of December 2020, and it is not clear whether this will be extended otherwise at the current time. If lifted, disclosure and communication with suppliers will be important to work through issues consensually and avoid such petitions. The other measures outlined on this page are permanent and include a restructuring moratorium and restructuring plan. These new permanent measures are likely to have long-term implications on UK restructurings and represent a shift in approach, adding new tools to the UK restructuring framework alongside others such as a company voluntary arrangement or scheme of arrangement. The moratorium is a standalone process to allow struggling companies time to pursue a rescue plan. The initial period is 20 days, but this can be extended. Oversight is provided by an external monitor who is an insolvency practitioner. However, management retain control of the day-to-day running of the business. The restructuring plan is a new tool like a scheme of arrangement, however has the ability to cram down dissenting creditors. It is therefore important to understand in instances whereby you find yourself as a creditor of a company with such a plan being imposed. The next couple of slides will explore the plan and its key aspects in further detail. To date, neither the moratorium or restructuring plan have been used extensively, with just a few examples being Virgin Atlantic and Pizza Express in respect to the latter. However, they may become more prevalent as government support subsides. Next page, please. The restructuring plan is a compromise between a company, its creditors, and/or its shareholders. Only a company which has encountered or is likely to encounter financial difficulties that are affecting or will or may affect its ability to carry on business as a going concern are able to utilise this tool. The plan divides creditors and shareholders into classes based on similar rights and interests determined by the applicant. The voting threshold is similar to a UK scheme arrangement, whereby 75% in value of those voting in each class need to approve the plan. However, only one class needs to approve the plan, provided it has a genuine economic interest in the company. It is this position and the mechanic available to cram down dissenting creditors which is the most significant, as classes with no economic interest in the company are excluded from voting but are still bound by the plan. Next page, please. So on this slide, we just set out a high-level comparison of the new restructuring plan next to a company voluntary arrangement and a scheme of arrangement. It remains too early to determine whether its use may replace other tools available, and indeed we have seen many CVAs and schemes continue to be proposed during the pandemic. As a result, it will likely form part of the toolkit available next year. In any event, it will be important for companies to be aware of its potential use, particularly if you find yourself in a class of creditor, a potential unsecured creditor, deemed to be without a genuine economic interest and have a plan imposed on you which may amend terms or otherwise. At this stage, precedents are not plentiful, and we expect valuation to play a key role in the application of any plan, as it needs to be demonstrated where the value breaks and the value of the relevant alternative. So with that context, it's also important to understand the current fraud risk landscape and the further financial strain placed on organisations who fall victim to fraudsters. I'll hand over to my colleagues Ben and Zoe, who will talk you through some of the recent matters that have landed on their desk.
Thanks, Chris. So while companies are dealing with all the types of issues Chris has described this past year, there is a danger that the day-to-day management of risk relating to financial crime takes a back seat, despite the fact that the risks they represent have changed significantly this year. So I'm going to focus on how they've changed to encourage some more thinking in this area, and then Ben's going to talk through some ideas as to how controls can assist in mitigating these risks. So the most frequent question, certainly I've been asked over the last 6 months, is fraud on the increase as a result of COVID? And to give a typical consultant's answer, well, to some extent yes, and to some extent no. The real question, though, that should be asked is, has the current situation increased the opportunity for wrongdoers to commit fraud? And the answer to that is yes, enormously. Of course it has. The working from home environment and inability to get out into the field of typical second and third line functions has massively stretched existing controls and governance structures and created gaps in which fraudsters can thrive. So what we've tried to do during this session, given we only have a short amount of time and could probably have filled the hour and 15 on our own, is to group into just 4 buckets based on experience and the trends we've seen so far in 2021, the main drivers of fraud and corruption risk in the current landscape, in order to help you as GCs, given that compliance more often than not reports into the GC in some way, shape or form, to help you think through the extent to which your company has sufficient controls in place to mitigate them and ask the right questions of the functions that report into you in that area. So to start with the first, making the point that corporates have reduced visibility over overseas operations is stating the obvious, but with the exception of probably only a handful of the issues I've investigated over the past 20 years, every single one that relates to fraud and corruption has occurred within an overseas subsidiary. And why? Well, usually lack of integration, culturally, of course, but also, and more importantly of late, technically. That issue is really coming to the fore. So despite a fancy accounting system at corporate level, subsidiaries often report simply by an Excel spreadsheet. Email infrastructure and IT infrastructure is still local, not centralized. And all of this means that it's almost impossible to do any form of monitoring or auditing unless you're on the ground, which more often than not isn't possible. So just one example of a case we've had this year involved whistleblower allegations of misconduct by a country head in Turkey of our client that was based in the UK. And the accusations surrounded diversion of business to related parties, prepayments to suppliers with no commercial basis, etc., etc. The client couldn't access the subsidiary on the ground. We couldn't get there ourselves, and it wasn't possible for them to access in-country books and records or email for all the reasons I've just set out. So the visibility of the situation on the ground was unclear. What the client needed was to assess the allegations and make a decision whether or not they should move forward to an overt investigation and involve local management. So we had to help them think through how to address this by leveraging a local team on the ground to gather data externally relevant to the allegations and guide the corporate's internal teams as to data to request for analysis. We managed to do what was necessary to enable them to then raise the right questions to the local team on the ground. However, it took much longer and was much more complex than it needed to be, all because these systems weren't integrated and there was very little that could be conducted by the corporate head office. So you need to be asking the questions of the relevant functions in your organisation as to how they feel about the accessibility of data remotely when sort of the worst case happens, as those issues inevitably land on the desk of the GC, who's left to deal with the problem when isn't necessarily responsible for making sure that the issue can be addressed appropriately. So moving over to false reporting and concealing of information, we have there's been several examples of high-profile false reporting frauds that have hit the headlines in the first half of this year. And this is an area where we work very closely with our restructuring colleagues, in that we're often called in to conduct the initial investigation when there's a suspicion around the appropriateness of figures in the accounts, and when those suspicions are realised, often then there's a requirement for our restructuring colleagues to come in and help management. But those that hit the headlines in recent year, this year and more recently, were really just an example of existing frauds that were exposed as a result of the financial pressures that COVID created. What we expect to see and will see in the coming years, based on the experience of the 07-08 financial crash, are a significant rise in these types of accounting misstatements and false reporting frauds. And the issue with those is they take time to come to the fore, 1, 2, even 3 years sometimes before it's apparent. When you start to see the following year, the problems are harder to hide. And why is that? Well, usually, and I say usually, it's the case of the well-intended wrongdoer. Employees and executives looking to massage figures to make budgets this year and hit targets during challenging times can book revenue too early, fail to provide for bad debts, hide liabilities off balance sheet. And it's amazing how this is undertaken without often the awareness of the C-suite. So really what's necessary is, the risk applies, to be honest, not just to the business in which you sit, but also to the suppliers and the customers that you're dealing with. So, the only way to try and address and mitigate this is greater and enhanced scrutiny and oversight and questioning of the financials within the business, and proper second and third line of defence monitoring, just at a time when those sorts of functions and oversight roles are being subject to cost cutting themselves. So moving to the next slide, Neil. I'm going to take the external threat in terms of the third bucket first, as this is where we've seen the greatest rise this year in terms of frauds against corporates. It was on the rise in 2019, but has hugely escalated in 2020. Now, these frauds take many forms: fake CEO, fake CFO, fake whoever, but fake senior executive, phishing, email spoofing, whaling. All of these types of frauds you'll be aware of, I'm sure, yourselves as GCs. But the point that we're trying to make here is they're getting bigger and bigger in terms of value. Back in the day, they used to be around the £1 million mark. Now they're in the tens and sometimes hundreds. And the current COVID situation in terms of lapsed controls, remote employees working from home is making corporates ever more vulnerable. To give an extreme example, one EU-based client we've been working with this year was the victim of a fraud in the hundreds of millions of dollars by an internal finance professional based out in the Far East. The corporate itself was researched by the organised criminal gang which targeted them. She was targeted due to her position herself and fell for what in effect was a typical romance scam, where completely out of character she was convinced to make payments to settle tax liabilities, of course not really, but to facilitate her by now fiance, despite the fact she'd never met him and had only been in contact with him for 2 months, to transfer his wealth to her country so he would be with her. Once the initial few $1 million had been transferred, then she was sucked in and effectively blackmailed to make more and more transfers in the hope that the monies would be repaid. And this was a long time, tenured employee, and this was completely out of character. The funds were transferred around the world in an enormously complex laundering scheme. And that really is just going to show how organised these criminals are. Now, there's a common thematic amongst all the corporates that are targeted in a significant way. They're large, they're international, they have a number of foreign subsidiaries, and the finance function is the target within those foreign subsidiaries. In every case of the frauds that we've investigated, none of the corporate victims would ever have believed, one, that this could happen to them because they're too big, they've got sufficiently robust controls, their employees are aware of these issues, and secondly, none of the corporates could ever believe that their employees could have been so naive and often expect some form of foul play at the start. So if there's one learning point you should take away from this, it's that the external fraudsters of today behave like sophisticated international corporates themselves. They're organised, coordinated, international, and adapt swiftly to the environment they operate in, hitting thousands of entities a day to find the weak spot. And to succeed, they all rely on the risk posed by the weaknesses inherent in human nature. And again, the only real way of mitigating this type of fraud is robust controls that evolve and change with the environment that companies are operating in, and constant awareness raising to employees of these types of frauds, as opposed to reliance on the dreaded annual online fraud awareness training. And finally, sort of the internal threats to susceptible employees. We're not talking here about inherent wrongdoers sat within an organisation, but instead those that through circumstance and opportunity might step over the line. Operating processes have changed dramatically over the past 9 months, but very few corporates have adapted their internal control environment to correspond to this change. So there's a perfect storm of pressure on staff to hit targets and secure deals, often big changes in terms of supply chains and a lagging control evolution to deal with the situation which is creating opportunity. So whether it's an employee taking advantage of this opportunity to defraud or retain a third party quickly that may represent conflicts of interest or make a payment to secure a deal, they're now likely to have a far greater opportunity to do so. So what you need to be thinking about is, how has our environment changed? How have we taken that into account in our internal governance structures? And how do these need to be adapted to assess and monitor these risks? So I'm now going to hand over to Ben to talk about some practical measures to mitigate the risks that we've just outlined. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Zoe, and good morning, everybody. Sorry, Neil, could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. Zoe has talked through some of the live issues we've seen this year, which have largely resulted from the change risk landscape, but there are proactive steps that can be taken to manage these contemporary risks. In the same way that the threats are evolving, compliance functions and organisations more generally need to be flexible to change with the times and the current threats. As we see it, the compliance function seeks to identify the risks faced by the business, and it then deploys its resources in an effective and efficient manner to counter those risks. Critically, however, it also needs to do these two things in a way that demonstrates to the business and the outside world, including law enforcement, regulators and investors, that the business has a firm grasp on its risk profile. Whilst the diagram here has 3 distinct components, each component impacts and shapes the others, meaning that, and actually ideally so, the compliance function is in a constant state of evolution and flux as it adapts to the demands of changing risk environments. In its June 2020 guidance, the US Department of Justice, and it's always wise to consider their view of the world, discussed the importance of an empowered compliance function, understanding why the business has set up its compliance function the way it has, and the need for continuous compliance. For the compliance function to be empowered, it first needs a business to structure it appropriately. There clearly is no one right or wrong way as to the best structure, as different industries face different risks. The risks to an extractive business will differ from a financial services business, and again from a fast-moving consumer goods business. And so the compliance needs to be considered and set up in a way that suits the particular business. And it may be the case that if the business is diversified across a range of industries, then compliance will need to reflect this and possibly have compliance sub-strategies in place. The continuous compliance aspect requires ongoing monitoring of third parties and situations throughout their life cycle of interactions with the business, beyond just the initial onboarding or first assessment, to ensure that these changing circumstances are factored in and evaluated. And sticking with the DOJ's thinking for a moment longer, whilst its recent comments were in relation to DPAs, the DOJ requires DPA companies to integrate data analysis into their compliance programs to root out misconduct. As a result, the thinking is that in time, data analysis will become a standard element of compliance programs across all businesses. I think the rationale here is that we should not be expecting issues to be highlighted or reported by staff when the business has the ability to highlight automatically its own risks using its own information. To labour that interaction between these components points, this self-diagnosis can and should be used to guide the thinking and ultimately the structure of the compliance function. The third component on the diagram is being able to access the business's current risk position easily and in a digestible manner. The risk position can't be seen in the same way as a year-end audit, i.e. a snapshot in time, or else whereby a specifically commissioned review needs to be authorised. Instead, it needs to be that if a question is asked, can an accurate answer be quickly assembled and given? The requirement for real-time awareness lends itself to the use of dashboards and visual and interactive tools that have remote and instant access, including across geographic locations. In addition to having the overarching risk position to hand, it's important that the business has the ability to track its live issues through to resolution. This ability to do so not only identifies bottlenecks or gaps in the compliance process, but it allows the business to demonstrate with confidence to law enforcement or regulators that matters are seen through to completion, or if not, then is able to explain why. The interplay between these three components, particularly actually in allowing the use of data to drive some of the risk management thinking and direction, it is key to businesses keeping its compliance function relevant and looking in the right direction. As Zoe discussed, sometimes fraud risks materialise, and when they do, civil litigation is often the preferred route for the recovery of value. Rob will consider the use of insolvency powers, particularly when combined with investigative and intelligence gathering skill sets, as an alternative option.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, my name is Rob Armstrong. I lead our contentious insolvency department here at Duff Phelps. It's probably best just to give you a quick overview of what contentious insolvency is. So it really brings together the two things you've heard already from Zoe, Ben, and Chris. So the restructuring options which are available, and then the risk of fraud. So contentious insolvency is likely to be a situation where there is allegations or concerns about director misfeasance or fraudulent activity within a company which has been placed into a formal insolvency process. As Neil was saying at the start, I think over the next 18 to 24 months, everyone's expecting there is going to be a large increase in the number of insolvencies that we see. And unfortunately, that's probably going to impact all of you in relation to suppliers and customers that you deal with. Now, the first instance that you will really be aware that one of your customers or suppliers has entered an insolvency process will be when you get formal notification from an insolvency practitioner who's been appointed. This can be by way of a formal notice, or it can even be the report from the insolvency practitioner which outlines the circumstances surrounding the insolvency itself. What should you look out for? I guess there will be things that you may be aware of through your dealings with the company, or there may be things which you become aware of through the reporting from the insolvency practitioner themselves. These might include out-and-out fraudulent activity where you believe your firm's become the victim of a scam, which could include sending money in through one of the schemes that Zoe said, about earlier, because these are very, very sophisticated criminals that you could be dealing with, and they do need to use corporate structures in order to use the scams and to make the things look realistic when they're implementing the different schemes that they're undertaking. It could also be director misfeasance, where you just don't believe that directors been operating in the best interest of yourselves as creditors. Or we have heard about the suspension of wrongful trading, but that shouldn't be confused with saying that directors no longer have any personal liability. There are still a number of other powers within the Insolvency Act which can find a director of a company personally liable and cause them to have to contribute to the insolvency estate if they are so. Certain transactions might be questionable, so that could be paying associated companies in preference to other creditors, mainly yourself. It could be transferring assets or valuable pots of cash or shares that the company owns to other subsidiaries or companies for undervalue. And then it could be the actual insolvency process itself. So I'm sure you're all aware of pre-pack administrations. If you think that the actual administrator of the company themselves has sold the company or the business itself at an undervalue back to an associated company, then that transaction itself is something that could potentially be looked at. I think it's important to say that obviously, although we expect insolvency numbers to increase, by no means are we expecting the majority of that to include contentious insolvency situations. We'll still be in the minority, but I think a common misconception is that an insolvency process itself is the death knell of any kind of recoveries. If you get a report that says, there's no assets in the estate, then you should write off all chances of a recovery. It's just not the case. There are options available to you, and there are things that you should seek to do if you do believe that there's been some form of fraud or wrongdoing. The first, if you get one of these situations, is to raise them with the office holder who's already in office. Usually you'll be sent a questionnaire as a creditor, which you can fill out. You can highlight these concerns, or you can speak directly to the insolvency practitioner themselves and ask them what action they're going to take in respect of these concerns. In respect of liquidations and administrations, there's an option for you to seek for a committee to be formed, and you can sit as a member of that liquidation or creditors committee. That really gives you access to more information in respect of the liquidation, and it also gives you the opportunity to drive strategy. So if you think there are things that need to be investigated, as a committee member, you can direct the liquidator or administrator to do so. Thirdly, one of the things obviously the office holder is going to be interested in is obtaining authorization for their remuneration for the work they're doing. Now, if you're not happy with the work that the office holder has conducted during the period, then you can obviously withhold your consent for remuneration. And if you think that they've acted inappropriately or not in the best interest of creditors, then you can seek to challenge remuneration at court. So that's quite a powerful tool that you have. Again, you can complain to the regulator if you don't think the office holders acted in the best interest of creditors or in accordance with their duties. And then finally, if you're really unhappy and you have sufficient votes and enough power within your stakeholder role within the company's liquidation or administration process, you could seek to replace the administrator or to have a joint administrator come in and specifically look at the issues that you're not happy with. So they're really the means that you can take to try and control an insolvency process that you're a stakeholder in. And the purpose of trying to control it is obviously to direct the office holder to look at the issues that you're concerned about, and then use the powers of the Insolvency Act to try and recover monies for the benefit of the creditor group as a whole. Now, I'll go on to that in a minute, but one of the reasons that often isn't undertaken in these situations is because if it is a fraudulent undertaking, the directors have undertaken the business with a view to trying to maximise their profits and the monies that they've withdrawn, then it's unlikely that they're going to leave a pot of cash for an office holder to undertake these investigations. So one of the things you'll quite often hear is, I would like to look at all of these things, but I have no means of doing so. There's no funds in the estate. There's no way of paying for these investigations you want me to do. And quite honestly, that's not the case. There are a number of options which are available when there's no assets in the estate. One is to seek funding from the creditors themselves. If the creditors think that there is a route of recovery and they're quite happy to undertake paying for the investigations, then they could look to fund the administrator or the liquidator, and any funding that's put forward would rank as a first charge from realisations. The other option is that the office holder could work on a contingent basis. So they could say, we'll undertake these investigations, and then perhaps we'll do it on a success fee basis or a percentage of realisations from recoveries. But they'll defer their time costs for the investigations that they're working on at the time. And thirdly, there's litigation funders. There is an active market now of litigation funders who will look to either fund or take assignment of claims in this matter, which again can result in potentially just a purchase of the funds, which would result in a return to creditors. I'll look at the recovery and the investigation tools in a bit more detail on the next slide now, Neil. If you just want to turn the page, Neil. And we can see that there's a number of, the Insolvency Act itself gives a number of powers to insolvency practitioners, and they're quite draconian in some ways. We can force office holders and third parties to disclose information. We can in fact get them to be interviewed before the court if they refuse, and quite often those orders come with penal notices. So if they refuse to attend before the court, then they'll actually find themselves in jail. We can collect any kind of information, whether that's hard books, copy records, or we can go and image computers, seize mobile devices, even do search and seizure orders against personal properties of the directors or third parties if we believe that there's likely to be books and records of the company there. So the powers to actually get in company records and investigate the situation, that there isn't anyone who has far-reaching powers like this apart from criminal investigations by the SFO or FCA. So we really can get underneath the bonnet and do a proper investigation to find out what's been going on in the company in the period leading up to the insolvency. Obviously, the aim of that is to potentially get claims against third parties. It can result in the voiding of certain transactions and the return of assets to the company. It can result in compensation or contribution orders against third parties to restore the estate or to compensate the creditors to whatever the amount is that the wrongdoing has incurred. And it can also mean that we can end up with claims against insurers such as P&I and D&O policies, which obviously are there for the benefit of trying to increase the recoveries and for the benefit of creditors. So the one thing I'd like to leave you with is that, yes, there's likely to be a number of insolvencies that are going to come across your desks. Unfortunately, some of those are going to involve wrongdoing on the part of those companies, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no route of recovery in respect of those options. So I'd always advise you to firstly engage with the office holders who are in office and to raise any concerns that you have. And if you're not happy with their conduct, then you can always reach out to another insolvency practitioner and seek a second opinion of the options which are available to you. I'll hand across now to Eddie, who's going to take you through what corporate governance options are available to you to minimise risks.
Thanks, Rob. As you've heard, there's a lot going on in the GC's world that poses a threat both financially and reputationally. Chris, Zoe, Ben and Rob have been talking about restructuring, fraud and insolvency, and I'd now like to turn to some positive action from a corporate governance perspective that can be taken to get your own house in order to mitigate these threats. We've found that many organisations with legal and COSEC teams all working remotely have used lockdown as the right time to refine and improve their corporate governance framework and instigate corporate simplification projects. As many of you will appreciate, stakeholders from shareholders to lenders to pension trustees are increasingly insistent upon simplicity and transparency. For the next couple of slides, I'm going to cover what appropriate corporate governance looks like and the current simplification trend that we are seeing. I think it's fair to say that everyone agrees that some governance is essential to reduce corporate risk, but few define it the same way. The term encompasses a lot. At a macro level, it's about business integrity and transparency, and at a more detailed level, it's about fulfilling specific obligations such as hiring a co-sec for an overseas entity or recording board minutes for a non-core subsidiary. One thing's for certain though, corporate governance has never been more important than it is now, and this slide highlights some of its key facets. In a nutshell, it's a framework to a successful business, a code of rules and regulations and best practice which, sorry, just lost my train of thought then. A code of rules and regulation and best practice which promotes the corporate behaviour of a company. It will enable informed decision making and give peace of mind that statutory and regulatory requirements are met with full compliance. It also ensures the corporate presents itself as accountable and transparent to key stakeholders in its strategy, risks and results, and embeds best practice in the boardroom and how the business serves its wider community. As you'll be well aware, most governance frameworks also focus on ESG, looking at an organisation's long-term strategic aims around ESG and how they add value and attract investment. This is ever more important in today's business world, of course. The governance of a corporate group and its responsibility to its stakeholders has been highlighted as a key reason why a company succeeds or fails. These risks can be operational, environmental, legal, regulatory, and the stronger the framework, the more the business is live to risk and the easier it is for management teams to make well-supported decisions. Corporate governance is applicable to all. It's just as important to a tech group growing internationally as it is for an established multinational, and just as relevant to a far-flung subsidiary as it is to HQ. Undoubtedly, a sound governance structure that ensures statutory compliance globally is a valuable asset for any organisation. And before we move on from this slide, I think it's important to say that the perception of corporate governance is evolving. Previously seen as an irritation, even by global groups, and something that must be done to comply with financial reporting requirements. Nowadays, stakeholders, including investors and regulators, place more emphasis on effective governance, in turn placing more responsibility on senior management to know their business and how it is governed inside out. On this basis, it's savvy to have a framework that enables global statutory and regulatory compliance. There's a widespread expectation amongst stakeholders that businesses aren't just focused on maximising short-term shareholder value. It's bang on their agenda that businesses are a force for good socially and environmentally in the long term. Investors look to invest in companies that major on these important factors as much as traditional financial metrics. Next slide, please, Neil. And in this slide, I'm going to cover corporate simplification as a potential avenue for streamlining your governance requirements. Periodically, it's beneficial to look at your entity structure, review whether it is fit for purpose, and determine whether action should be taken to simplify it. Organisations grow through acquisition, organically or a combination, leading to their corporate structures becoming increasingly complex. Tax-driven structuring and financing arrangements also lead to entity formation and another layer of complexity. They grow fast and it's easy to lose track of legal entities. You'd be surprised how many corporates do not possess one version of the truth when it comes to their entity structure. And this lack of insight and control leads to inefficiency and risk. A corporate simplification, or as it's often known, an entity rationalisation exercise, will focus on or result in the elimination of entities. And we often work with corporates to deliver a positive change programme unique to them. So why do corporates do it? Well, as indicated on the slide, there are a number of reasons, and I will cover some briefly. They do it to increase value. As simplifying your structure can undoubtedly save money, but there are other ways it creates value. As already discussed, it can make governance and compliance simpler and free up management time to be used more productively elsewhere. But actually, if you ask me, the most valuable aspect is that it unlocks potential for your business to transform by removing barriers to growth. It also provides risk protection. Just to cite a recent example, we recently worked with a client that had paid little attention to its entity structure for the past 5 years, a period when they'd been highly acquisitive. They had begun to receive a number of unexpected claims in the form of employer liability claims and warranty claims against companies that were now sort of inactive, that HQ were having to settle. Reputationally, it made sense for them to do so. Thankfully, the quantum wasn't overly significant, but they were in no position to rebut them as the corporate memory had long gone. This was a factor in prioritising corporate simplification. They do it to help with transformation. Simplification makes it easier to instigate transformation programs, without a doubt, like implementing new ERP systems, or perhaps adapting to tax, legislative change, or other regulatory change. They do it to increase transparency for stakeholders. I mean, I've already mentioned the emphasis that's being placed on this, but something I heard from a GC once that resonated with me is, if you can't explain your entity structure easily to your employees, then it's probably not fit for purpose to explain to your investors, lenders, and regulators. And lastly, they do it to align the entity structure with the operating model. Organisations are going to be pivoting to the new normal, and their operating models will need to adapt. They will go for a period of change. At this time, it's opportune to align the entity structure with the operating model as part of that change. So what are the typical results that we'll see from corporate simplifications can be bucketed into three categories: cost reduction, risk mitigation, and operational efficiency. From a cost perspective, both externally in terms of reduced professional costs associated with maintaining entities, and internally from productivity gains that come with back office functions and management not being sucked into non-core activity. From a risk perspective, as entities are eliminated and the corporate risk of a liability crystallising in the entity structure that has a cascade effect on the group, that risk is reduced. And also there will be reduced personal risk for directors, as they will have a better handle on the group and its activities and be able to demonstrate compliance with their ever expanding fiduciary duties. With regards to operational efficiency, you'll create an agile business and entity structure that is more adaptable to change, and one where you improve its value and marketability and attractiveness to investors. We see corporate simplification projects follow a typical life cycle, customized to the needs of each corporate. There are typically 6 stages. So the planning stage would involve the refinement of the business case, getting the buy-in of key internal stakeholders, and identifying relevant internal resource to deliver the project. And then you'd look at feasibility and validating the entity structure, determine which entities are in scope for elimination, and then deciding on how revolutionary you want to be, whether everything is in scope, whether we are looking at the whole group, or just lower hanging fruit such as inactive entities, non-core vehicles, and perhaps intermediate holding companies. And then you'd move into due diligence, ensuring that all assets and liabilities are identified for the companies in scope, and that there are no legal, tax, or other risks that present barriers to elimination. And then you'd map out, and then you'd map out the steps that need to be taken to simplify and prepare each company for elimination. Now, this could include something as simple as a debt waiver, or be a bit more complex and involve moving businesses and assets around, or amending existing banking and security arrangements. And then you'd eliminate appropriate companies. This would involve affecting the relevant statutory mechanism, which traditionally in Europe would be either liquidation, merger, or straight dissolution. And lastly, I'd always say that it's important that once you've been through a corporate simplification project, once regular health checks of the structure take place, whether that be on a periodic basis or upon a new large acquisition or a change in legislation. I think it's important that the structure is not allowed to proliferate again. I always look upon corporate simplification is akin to clearing out your garage. It's never quite number one on your to-do list, but once you've done it, you'll feel good about it, and you'll probably have unearthed lost treasures, identified the wasp's nest in the corner, and created the space to fit your car in, thereby making your insurance cheaper and reducing the risk of it getting stolen off your driveway. So with that, I'm now going to pass back to Neil for his closing remarks.
Okay, thank you, Eddie. So I think but just before we get into the Q&A, and I think I can see 1 or 2 questions already, actually. Just to briefly sum up, I think that I mean it would be an oversimplification to say that you know, this period is different, but I think we all think it really is in a pretty significant way. I don't think there's been a time certainly in recent history where we've been through a period where so much money, so much support has been extended so quickly at a financial level. We also haven't been through a period where there's been so little information gathering or fact finding, and you know, I guess call it due diligence, if you will. You know, the necessity was sort of to get on with it, and to an extent there wasn't time to do that in the way that we're generally accustomed to. I think the 07-08 period was tough, but markets recovered very quickly as interest rates started to fall. Today we've heard that the restructuring tools are different, but there is a wider group of stakeholders, I think, and they're often non-financial, I think, in nature. And I think that they add to the importance of heightened monitorship, more regular oversight. We've talked about overseas subsidiaries and just generally an environment where everybody's under, you know, significant pressure. A more dynamic assessment, possibly of risk, and just simply to the phrase on the slide, just trying to do things the right way. And I think certainly from the standpoint of Kroll, the financial investigations proposition has always been a cornerstone skill set for us. But I think we've seen much more case-related traffic around often independently reviewing things like corporate compliance and ethics. We've seen much more interest from investors in corporate culture. And in general, I think to this slide, I think we've seen many more situations come to us which have a non-financial flavour. And I definitely believe that while investors are always interested in financial returns, they're also interested in how they're achieved and also the consequences of them, to be honest with you. We've had the benefit of Rob's insight into contentious insolvency situations, and perhaps the chronology here, I think, is that our financial investigations practice, and there's a question that relates to this in a minute, you know, we've started to see more cases that result from financial wrongdoing in this environment. And going back to the stats, you know, in the early part of the session, even though the number of administrations is currently low, we're sure that situation is going to reverse over the next 12 to 24 months as financial support gets progressively withdrawn. We've seen more attention focused on shortening and simplifying supply chains, and as I said, more appetite for a level of independent review. Possibly, I think, in response to ensuring best practice, but in a governance context, to Eddie's point, but possibly in response to the stakeholder groups that we've also referred to, who I think are greater in number, and I also think that there's a materially heightened level of media interest in these kind of issues as well. So I think we've got a few minutes left at the end of the session for Q&A. There are some questions in already. And so I think there's two questions that I can see that directly hit on sort of elements of what was being discussed just now. So I have a feeling that this one might be you, Ben, but let's see. One of the questions is what immediate concerns should businesses be thinking about in terms of controls being stretched as a result of distanced working?
Yeah, but happy to pick that one up. Thanks, Neil. Well, I think there's probably a couple of points here that need to be considered. And that the first is probably around authorization and challenge. Are the existing controls within the business around authorization of payments, onboarding of third parties, changes to internal systems, are these still robust? And how have written authorizations or physical documents that feature in those requests, how are the controls evolved or being considered around those? Obviously, it's difficult to go into specifics, but I suppose the second or the flip side to that coin is how easy is it for management to challenge these requests for payments or authorizations? Clearly, management doesn't want to be seen to be slowing down the operations of the business, but without being able to stop by somebody's desk or to query things in a quick and almost informal way if necessary. How has management evolved to speak to these people and to challenge and seek confirmation of information? So I think that's one double-sided concern, and the other is the proximity between members of staff. The working from home, the distance working, that's clearly put stretched the controls, created gaps into which fraudsters will try to insert themselves and manipulate scenarios. So it's up to businesses to try to be creative in how they close this distance and ensure that there's still the mechanisms by which that staff can raise concerns and likewise management can challenge issues. Nobody wants to have a diary full of endless video calls, but I suppose with one eye on C-suite frauds, CEO frauds, CFO frauds, senior staff need to make sure that they're in regular contact with gatekeepers of funds, as Zoe mentioned earlier. Higher level professionals in the finance department should be a priority to make sure that they have ready and easy access, that the concerns can be discussed.
Right, thank you, Ben. So okay, there's the next question. Are there any actions you can take as a creditor prior to a formal insolvency procedure where you suspect fraud or wrongdoing is taking place? And I suspect that's probably Rob.
Yeah, I'll take that on, Neil. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. As I was saying earlier, the Insolvency Act has got a number of powers. It's quite draconian in some respects, and always, I would say, early engagement is the key. So if you're in a situation where you think you are trading with a party that you're a creditor of, and you think they're acting in a dishonest or potentially fraudulent way, then there are options that you can take, such as interim orders or provisional liquidation, where you can actually get an office holder appointed in order to get in there and protect the assets of the company ahead of a formal winding up or administration of the company. That they're quite extreme measures, but sort of more standard routes would obviously be to petition for the winding up of the company or for an administration order as a creditor. But you really do want to have someone in control of the process who understands the concerns that you have and is trying to act in the best interest of the creditors from the earliest outset. So yeah, definitely I would always advise you to seek advice from an insolvency solicitor, from an insolvency practitioner, if you believe that you potentially are a creditor of a fraudulent enterprise. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you, Rob. Eddie, I think this might be for you. In your experience, streamlining corporate governance aside, are there any other factors that trigger a corporate to undertake a corporate simplification exercise? Is Eddie there? Have we lost him?
He's on mute.
Sorry, Neil. Schoolboy error.
Oh, it's all right. Don't worry. Did you hear the question?
Yeah, I got it, Neil. I got it.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, there could be any number of reasons. I'll touch on a couple. Large acquisitions or a series of acquisitions leads to additional structures being bolted on to the existing one. This leads to more complexity, more than one entity doing the same thing. Duplicate service companies, for example, duplicate real estate holding companies, and plus you'll off the back of that you'll often see hive ups creating a slew of inactive companies. So group simplification is seen as part of the integration. Another reason could be where a corporate have had their fingers burned in the past. For example, an unexpected liability crystallizing in an inactive company that could have been eliminated much sooner, frankly, or perhaps even macroeconomic events such as Brexit or COVID, obviously bringing about fundamental changes to the operating model, with the adjustment of the legal entity footprint being part of that change. So that's just a few of sort of the reasons that I've seen and am seeing.
Right. Thanks, Eddie. And I think touching on something which might be being asked just to flesh out a little bit. I'm being asked if actually we are seeing an increase in the number of fraud cases following the start of the pandemic. I think we sort of touched on this a couple of times, but maybe Ben or Zoe, I don't know if you would just flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah.
I think I can guess what the answer probably is, but you're the two experts, so yeah, go for it.
Shall I pick that one up, Ben? I think the honest answer is we definitely saw a downturn in sort of up until June, July, when quite frankly and understandably corporates were just doing what they had to do to survive, with the exception of them being hit by a major sort of cyber fraud or something similar. I would say over sort of October onwards, things have returned a bit more to normal, where there's sort of the more companies willing to investigate when appropriate and when necessary. I think the biggest change or surprise for us since that time period has been a huge uptick in the proactive requests from corporates for bribery, corruption and fraud risk assessments, which frankly, were not something that was significantly requested in 2019 and pre all of this. But we've definitely seen a significant trend in those sorts of requests towards the back end of this year.
Right, thank you. Go on. No, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I was just going to say, the huge tidal wave that everyone talks about, it's steady. It's not a tidal wave, and that sort of volume, I don't think any of us expect to come through until the fallout is more known of all of this.
Right. Okay. Right. So I think I'm probably feeling like I'm going to draw the session to a close, actually. I don't know if there's any other questions that anybody wants to ask, but safe to say that I think the deck is being distributed anyway, and the contact details of each of the participants in the call are actually in the deck. So I would encourage you, please feel free to reach out, and if you haven't asked a question, or if you want clarification or more information about anything that we've talked about this morning, then just feel free to either access through GLL or directly in terms of the email addresses that have been given on the deck. I hope in some way, going back to my positioning at the beginning, that, you know, when I said, look, we've broadly got 3 objectives, I hope that in some way we've fulfilled the 3 objectives. I hope it's been interesting for you, and you know, I hope you've enjoyed the session. And just on behalf of all of us, thank you for taking the time to come to the session, and thank you for taking the time to listen to us. We're all very grateful. So please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil, and thank you everyone. That was fantastic.